Hi, I'm Terry Kirkham from Global Business Auctioneers and Valuers. In 2025, I want to do something special for the veterans community. And that's why we chose to sponsor a veteran story with This Story Australia. Today, I'm glad to introduce Matt Williams OAM. Matt served Australia in the Army from 2014 to 2021, deploying to Afghanistan. Upon his return, Matt was told at the age of 22 that he had terminal brain cancer. Matt started an Instagram page, Willie Beating Cancer, and he has spent the last few years as a freelance conflict media producer on the realities of modern warfare, fighting cancer, increasing awareness and raising money for cancer research. Matt received the Medal of the Order of Australia. It is our pleasure to share Matthew's story here today.
Introducing yourself is always difficult, isn't it? Like, who am I? Where am I going? I don't know, I'm Matt Williams. Most people know me as Willie OAM. I've got a Queen's Order of Australia for service to the nation through cancer initiatives. I served in the Army for a number of years, and then since leaving, I've been for a number of years reporting on, as the introduction said, the realities of modern warfare. I think a lot of us are seeing what a modern battlefield actually looks like. The similarities between, ancient battlefields to more contemporary battlefields. The lessons are still there, but of course the weapons have changed. But the men remain the same, and now that's basically what I'm exploring. I'm from a very average family. I was born in Warrnambool, Victoria. I moved to South Australia with the Defence Force back in 2000 and I must have been 15. I moved across here and I've just never left. A lot of my friends, they've moved off, either gone home, back to where they grew up, or they've moved with work. I've stayed. I really enjoy Adelaide. But as a kid, myself and my brother, we were pretty average guys. He's 2 and a bit years older than myself. Mum and dad, average working middle class people. Dad's an engineer for an electricity company and my mum's a nurse. They've only actually both just retired in the last 3 months, basically just retired. As it always is, before you finish work, you take your sick leave you've never taken and all of this. So the actual retirement day versus unemployment day might be a bit different. But my brother and I, we grew up racing push bikes, basically. BMX bikes, then into mountain biking and whatever. And my brother, he's now still in that scene. A couple of years older than myself, but he's I'd sort of say semi-successful, semi-professional, full-time downhill mountain bike rider living in New Zealand. And is half riding and half he's an engineer himself, building very boutique mountain bike parts, 3D printed, titanium lathed, all these very high-end nerdy stuff, as I'd tell him. But we grew up, average government schools, government life. I was always a little bit more loose, a little bit more social than he is. I think a lot of the story of my early life to very junior army life sums up that almost cheekiness of being a digger that we hear about. And I think myself and the group of mates I found myself in, it just was an epitome of that. We were there to do the job, but we're also there to have a good time. We're there to have a beer with the boys after work. We're there to make the officer's life more difficult than RMC told them that it was going to be. But I knew from an early age that is just what I was going to do. From my first steps, my first words, it was just all army. That's just what I wanted to do. And people ask me all the time, why did you join the army? And I don't have a good answer for it. I actually think a lot of people's answers for that is a little bit fabricated. They have this grandiose idea of, I want to serve the nation, I want to do this, I want to do that. Maybe it is that, but for me it wasn't one particular thing. It was just an attraction to that. It was just an attraction to everything. Even the bad, even the difficult parts. I saw that as just part of the job, as a challenge. So of course, when I turned 18, I was in the late stages of high school, and that's when I went through the recruiting process to join the infantry. Initially, I wanted to direct entry commando. Luckily for me, at Defence Force Recruiting, I had, my last interview was with an infantryman, and he was a realist about it. He's like, look, the direct entry commandos is a lot for guys who have previously served or are a bit older, who have had a decade of life experience. I think you'll probably get bumped off that course being 18 and you're in a little bit more of a difficult trajectory into the infantry from there. If you want to do that, just do the normal route. And he probably saved me a lot of a sore back and sore knees. So yeah, off to Kapuka into the army, and that's, I guess, where everything started. Oh yeah, I was not a good student whatsoever. And a lot of people who I went to school with would see what I do now for a career and be like, how the hell did he end up there? I think a lot of people had that when I got the Order of Australia. It was like, this guy's the loosest guy I'd ever received one. It wasn't like, I was always an intelligent kid, I would say, but I never was just motivated for school, as a lot aren't. Like I finished and completed year 12, which is still a big thing. I tell people, like the lessons you learn from socialising, from being at school is brilliant. You know, if you can hold out, do it. Like if you could join the army midway through year 12 or at the end, complete it and go. It'll really help you out later in life. But I was more focused on, I think I was probably focused at school before I knew what alcohol and women were, and then there was that transition across, as many young men do, to tomfoolery, you know, hanging out with the guys. And to be honest, that taught me a lot about socialising, about being able to hold a conversation, maintain a conversation, work within a group of people, and from there led to my career in the army. And I wouldn't have had it any other way. Like I look back and think, this would have been handy at school, but I did maths and physics, like year 12 tertiary level stuff, but didn't excel in any of it. A lot of it sort of fell apart when I got accepted into the army. And I was like, why am I going to need this? I don't need this, mathematical methods or physics or this. Next year I'm off doing this. And of course, you only think in very short periods of time. And at that period of my life, it was 4 years, minimum sign up to the army. Seemed like forever. So I was like, well, I'm going to be there my entire life. And if I didn't have my diagnosis, I still would definitely be in the Defence Force. I would have been a lifelong member. There's been a few since, actually. I was the only one of that year who went. But then since, there's been a few joined later in life. Mostly Air Force and Navy. Probably got a bit of life experience, went better career that way, better long term. But no, not really. My small country city, I guess, of Warrnambool, it just didn't have a big army community at all. Well, I had fantastic mentors and commanders set you up for success before you even go, in the months prior, and all the rehearsals, all the training, everything. Like, you are ready to step into whatever. And you train in scenarios that is worst case. So you step into something and you've ran and you're stepping into a job there. And we were deploying on FPE 7 was the tour, which realistically is a moving of high value people around the country, like VIPs, logistical supply, not into those, what many people think of Afghanistan, of patrolling, getting in gunfights. That had finished by the time that I got there. But looking back, like at the time, I thought, I'm 20, I'm invincible, nothing can happen. Looking back now, I'm like, I was 20 when I was a young guy. So you have that realization after the fact. But deploying there, it's a crazy ride from getting selected to do the tour, out of a battalion of guys, and some went to Iraq, some went to Afghanistan, some stayed back. From getting selected to go through the training, through everything, all the medical, even just not getting injured because you'd be off the tour. Just those 4 to 6 months before is intense. And then deploying, of course, this is the first time I ever left Australia. I'd never been overseas. And you fly through the UAE, through Dubai, which is a huge thing just in itself, landing there and being like, this is a whole nother world that I'm in. And then from there, a couple of days, you get your weapon, you get your body armour. It's the first time you're putting real body armour plates, not just weighted plates in your armour, real ammunition, like all this. To then flying into Kabul, flying into HKIA, into the airport. And that was the first time I'd ever seen snow too. So we landed, it must have been January 2017, or close to that at least. And I'd never seen snow in my life. You're off the plane, initially you just get hit with this stench of Kabul, just smells like feces and smoke. A very poor country. First time seeing snow incredibly cold, incredibly mountainous. And you're there as a young guy and you don't really know what the next days, weeks, months have in store for you. We were meant to be there for 6 months and we got extended a couple of times, pushed out for me until just under 9, with just logistics matching up for the new people coming in to relieve us, as well as I did a handover to the next people coming in to fill my position. It's crazy. I deployed in a position of which I wasn't even qualified for previous to getting selected for this tour. Before this, I was light infantry, combat first aider. That was it. And got to know, we want you to be on the transport side of things. We want you to be in command of one of the vehicles. We've had a little bit of issues with the transport corps and the infantry and how that mixes. Probably all blame on the infantry for that one. That's where the ego sits. So we want to try and fuse these as we can, because we need the drivers to be transport corps. They are subject matter experts on these vehicles. But as far as the commanders for tactical movements on the ground, operating the machine gun, and working with the infantry on the ground, if you're outside of the vehicles and there's guys, we really want infantrymen in that position. Just for some difficulties of previous tours. Now, whether it worked or not, I don't know. There was still a lot of issues and frictions. So, I was selected to command and navigate one of the vehicles, and ended up into navigation of the convoys through Kabul as well, which is a city which is just a mess of streets and alleys, buildings. Areas where you could see were built up, like the big buildings and bridges were all Soviet stuff, but now that it all worn down, a lot of memories of better times there. And by all means, still a very dangerous place. You've got the green zone, which is basically a protected area in the middle, of which our camp sat outside of, but many of the bases sat within. So we were daily basically going between our camp and then other bases or wherever within green zone, or to wherever needed either equipment or if we had a VIP needed to move somewhere. And a VIP could be anyone from General Mattis of the US forces at the time through to a colonel in the Australian, or a brigadier in the Australian forces, or the New Zealand or the Brits or Dutch, anyone. We would move them around and facilitate those movements, everything, the protection, whatever. It's still in a very high stress, potentially very dangerous environment all the time. So it's a crazy thing as a young guy being there, looking back, being like, that actually happened. We were moving through and getting lost and, singing to Meatloaf in the cars. That was our thing. The guys before us, their good luck charm was leaving the gates to a Meatloaf song. And we just adopted that. And that was the funniest thing, was, of course, all the infantry guys, whatever, we're like, we've got the JBL speaker on singing Meatloaf. And you'd have some like VIP in the car being like, what? They're like, sorry, sir, but this is this tradition. We need to listen to 8 minutes of Paradise by the Dashboard Light and do a duet on the way. That's what you get. So yeah, we all in all, we had a really good time. Oh, look, I was very naive at the time, and I would have had a much different answer then to now about the legitimacy of the war, of the entire campaign, the cost, and of course now we know the outcome of a lost war. Did we give 20 years of opportunity? Yes. Did we lose the war but win every battle? Yes. The Soviets were the exact same. The Soviets did not lose a single position, nor did they lose a single battle, like us. But who remains in power there after the fact? That is the thing. And the West has a very long history of fighting wars as if they were individual battles. But at the time, no, there was no doubt at all about it. But we didn't think of it in terms of being just or not. It was my job. It didn't matter. If you asked me as a 20-year-old, 21-year-old there, if you came and interviewed me there and said, what are you here for? It would have been, I'm in the infantry and this is what's going, and, we deploy over here and, we're trying to train these Afghan forces so then the Taliban don't take back over, although, half of them defect and the other half get killed and then the other half just ditch anyway. There was never any doubt in it. And I still think there was incredibly good parts of our mission, like what we did and what our guys did, I'm very proud of. If you then zoom out in the whole coalition and the 20 years and the trillions of dollars being spent, we can start opening up massive legitimate questions, which have been closed since the fall of Kabul, that you're not allowed to question it. Because America in their infinite wisdom is incredibly embarrassed by this, incredibly embarrassed being the world's most powerful country, being defeated by dudes in sandals and sneakers, which was the outcome for the second time after Vietnam. And of those who have ever researched anything about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we should have well predicted this is exactly how it was going to occur. There's a fantastic book called Afghanistan, which is what the Russians or the Soviets refer to the Afghanistan veterans as. And the similarities between what the Soviets were up against and what we were up against was unbelievable. But we always came with there with the time frame to leave. And of course, that time frame got pushed and pushed and pushed. And no one was ever willing to pour in the resources, both man and machine, to have a victory there. What would a victory look like? Would a victory there be a type of colonial takeover? Is that what it has to be? But I think we, and when I say we, from the initial days through to the final days, gave almost every opportunity available for a much greater future that sadly fell over in a number of days and wasn't picked up. And this says a lot about the senior command and the politicians of these nations making the decisions, we never had an end goal. Like, there was never, this is what we want to achieve. That fell through. As soon as the first punch was landed, the first contact back in the early 21st century, we never had an end state. Like, what is our end state here? And it ended up costing that much money. We said, stuff this around. So we never had that. That is one of the main differences, I guess, between the coalition working in Afghanistan and the Soviets. Although near the end state got very opaque for the Soviets, they did have more of an end state, of an absorption of the state, which we, of course, never had. We never had this absorption of Afghanistan into the West. So, yeah, I think after the fact, for me, it's been a little bit more pondering and wondering about what we're there for. But I'm very proud of my service. I'm proud of all the Australians that served there. And as the overall mission, did we make mistakes? Yes, absolutely. The first mistake is we should have only trained female soldiers. The men had nothing to lose if they defect or they don't fight. If we went back, the way to do it is we have great success that females can be fantastic soldiers in a new age of contemporary warfare. The one thing you do is who is bound to lose the most if this country returns to as it is now or as it was? Females. Okay, we're training all the females. We tried it with dudes, so we tried it with dudes, it didn't work. So having a different approach, but again, and this is something you explore especially when you explore more authoritarian states, whether it be China or Russia or whoever in the histories as well, is a more holistic view of war as a tool of politics, but also as not an image in time or just an epoch, as a holistic state of the nation, almost like a video running through time. And this is one of the discoveries you have if you really look at how Putin or Russia see the war. They just see it as an extension of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the collapse of the Soviet Union, they see it as an extension of the Second World War, not this stop and start, which we do, where the Afghans started here, ended here, rather than what it may become as a holistic view. So, yeah, I don't regret any of it, but still, exactly what our mission was. We knew there was British colonels talk at the time back in the day that this was likely going to fail 20 years before it did. And sadly, with a lot of lives absolutely shattered, both guys there, both living and dying, and families of it, for something that is a really poor outcome. It is shown that your post-war mental health, if you will, I don't like the term PTSD, but how people then break down the war in their own head, is significantly worse for campaigns of which it looks like we have lost, and for campaigns of which you have travelled. So, for instance, currently in Ukraine, we don't know who the victor is going to be. Most likely it will be Russia, by any degree you're looking at the moment, by any metric. But after the fact, it will likely be Ukrainians who deal a lot better with the post-war attrition, which can lead in from everything from domestic violence to suicide to everything in between. due to the justness of the war, as well as if you're defending or you're an offensive force. That has a lot. And this is why we see that the rates of people struggling, men and women struggling post-Afghanistan, is significantly higher than campaigns of which had 50 times the combat. You to break down per 100 veterans, how many struggle with this, look at Vietnam, look at Afghanistan, then look at the Great Wars. You go, well, they must have seen more combat. They must have been through more. And no, it's to do with where you're going, what you're defending, the justness of it, and how the community perceives it as well. Which is why I really do fear for, Afghanistan finished up in 2021, whatever it was. I really do fear for the next decade of people that did the majority of fighting and what that looks like when they start leaving the forces. What we'll start getting over the next, say, decade is a lot of men who were in Afghanistan, fighting in Afghanistan, serving, start to leave the forces, and that's where a lot of that starts really picking up. Vietnam was the exact same. The decade following it looked all right. It's the decades after you start really getting struggles. And being in the service is a very unique thing, especially being in the infantry unit. I haven't had any experience outside of the infantry, so I speak from that. But I think the infantry is the most encompassing of the army. So if you tell a kid, draw the army, they draw the infantry. And we're going to say that. No kid wants to be a truck driver. They want to be on the back end of a machine gun, guys. Maybe that's my attraction to it. Maybe it's very monkey brain. But you have a unit with the average age was 19, 600 guys. You're all earning in Australia very reasonable money. And you're all mates. And even the guys you don't like, you share something that is larger than yourselves. And if you ask me, what do most people deal with when they leave the military that gets bracketed as this psychological issue? It's nothing to do with trauma. Nothing to do with trauma. It's 1% is that. The other 99% is a loss of identity, which is huge. That the actual amount of people that have seen traumatic combat scenarios within the army at this point in time is very, very few. But the amount of the deal with then a lack of identity, and this is not to minimise that, but we need to get to the root cause of this, is you leave that. I joined when I was 18. I went from school around my mate doing whatever to then around all my mates for several years, and then I'm just out on my own. And I've never applied for a Medicare card, and I've never done this, I've never done that. And I would normally wake up and be with the guys, and I was with tens of guys all the time, and then you're just by yourself, and you get a absolutely loneliness epidemic, which we have in the West, especially amongst men anyway, and that just gets, it's not that it's worse individually man to man, but it's from what you're used to as part of the infantry or as any close combat unit to now what it's become. The most I've struggled with my military service is when the 7th Battalion collapsed, and I was out of the forces. So November last year, so November 24, right here on where we're filming, we had the final parade of the battalion. And I was been out of the forces for 2 or 3 years at that point in time. Nothing to do with the military at the moment, except for coming and giving my 2 cents when requested on certain scenarios. But that was a real moment in time for me. It was the end of an epoch. It was the unit's gone. Not only the boys moving and they're all being posted out, but the 7th Battalion where I served and where all these guys, and there was all Vietnam vets here, it's gone. It's now no more. And that was a loss of identity that now doesn't exist. And I know it's the exact same for all of the boys over at Perth with 2 Squadron. That it was that is maybe the root cause of a lot that then spreads out. And that was very difficult. It's a hard thing. Leaving the forces is very difficult, especially if you've had no adult life previous to it. If you get in at 25 and get out at 30, you've lived a life before that. But if you've been a kid and then you're an adult, like day one of Kapooka, that's the hard thing. Kapooka is easy. There's not a single step at Kapooka of which I couldn't go home and get my girlfriend on the back of a machine gun in her pass by the afternoon. There's no single aspect of that. The difficulty with Kapooka is you are entering as a civilian, you have to leave as a soldier, and they've got 90 days to do it, or however long it is these days. That's the difficulty. And most people are coming in at 18, and you need to be a grown adult day one of this. That's the difficulty in it. And that's what makes everything, compounds the difficulty of very simple tasks. And they do a very good job, the recruit instructors there, in facilitating this, as brutal as it may have to be at times. But you are indoctrinated into a certain way. Forces, militaries need to have an indoctrination and a propaganda to have forces to be able to go to not question exactly what you're doing and go up and over a trench. Australian forces, we absolutely see initiative and personal initiative as one of our core aspects. But there is a limit to that. We still need guys who are prepared to not question exactly what we're doing and go over the top of a trench into machine gun fire if needed. You can't, at the end of the day, you still need a level of indoctrination of this is what we're here to do. Your personal thoughts about this need to be pushed out, and this is exactly what's happening. There still has to be an aspect of that. Your initiative starts and stops at tactical, small level strategic actions. Let the higher ups worry about larger scale war strategy, operational movements. So there has to be that, and that's a difficult change for a young guy. Young people tend to push back very, very strongly on change. If you're in the infantry, what do you go and do? What else is going to fulfill you to that same standard? And a lot of guys, if you asked anyone on my tour at the end of Afghan, you've done 8 months plus there, do you want to do it again? Do you want to go on the next trip and just stay on for another? Yeah, every single guy would have said yes. I'm sure some would have taken a week leave, but everyone else would have said yes. Because you were just living in a bubble. You are in a bubble of, you have a clear mission, this is what we're doing, there's no outside stresses, and absolutely. The world is more complex for me now being outside of the military than when I was in. Absolutely. So I got back from the tour, had a little bit of leave, but leave got cut short to go on promotional courses by the end of 2017. So massive year from deploying to courses to whatever. And then right on tail end of 17, I did some traveling when I got some actual leave, and then coming back to work in 2018. So this is only 4 months after the tour and all this stuff. I just started getting really bad recurring headaches. Like I could not shake this headache. And someone would be able to pick out the specific date of this, but it was whenever the Australian Defence Force went from a codeine drug being over the counter, can use it, to if you take that and you piss hot, you'll get kicked out under a drug test. So whatever date that was the only thing I was staying on top of with my headaches. So it was like that day, I'm like, Sarge, I need to go to the medical centre and get a script. And I went down to a doctor, and he wasn't that surprised. You've dealt with some high stress stuff. You've had probably a knock to the head or once or twice. Look, because you're in the army and you've been dealing with this, it's very easy for us to get you a CT scan. Go down. I'll give you a imaging referral. Go down, get a scan, go from there. That afternoon, I thought this is all a piss take. Went down, got a CT, and basically I knew something may have been wrong when the imaging specialist rang me when I was driving home and said, look, I can't get in touch with your doctor, but you need to come back because we want to do an MRI, which is just a much better, clearer image of how the systems work. Because I'd seen something and we need to get a better picture of what it is. But they couldn't tell me any of that. We just want you to come back in to redo imaging. Doctor eventually comes through and they found a spot. We have no idea, whatever. Turns out, they'd found something. My GP in the army, he's of course not qualified to talk on specifically what this is. He's not a neurosurgeon. And he would be outside of his realm if he tried to diagnose something like this too. But he looked after me fantastically. Emergency referral to a neurosurgeon. And the neurosurgeon was dumbfounded at the symptom of headaches. Because he said, what else is there? Do you have any problems in your right hand? Do you have any problems in your right leg? No. And he's like, it's not going to make sense unless you've done a decade in neurosurgery, but you will not have a headache from this. I know that people think you've got a 42 mil tumour in your head that could cause a headache. He's like, that's not how this works. It's not that simple. And he said, do you have any other injuries at all that could be causing this? And turns out I had some tightness in my shoulders because I was in a vehicle, an armoured vehicle, in body armour for several months. You sort of hunched over on the machine gun, whatever. And I just had some real bad stress in some muscles. I went to the physio, got some dry needling and a massage, cleared up my shoulders, cleared up my headaches. So it's been completely no symptoms of the tumour whatsoever. So it was a complete accident that we found this. Typically, this tumour is found through seizure or a loss of something in your right hand, specifically where mine is. So it's left frontal lobe on the motor strip. So it was a complete accident that we found this, which, of course, it depends how you look at this. Some people would look at it as, oh, you could have just continued living without ever knowing. But also that we've caught it very early. You can start, treatments to try and at least prevent, this to deteriorate further. So next thing, the next couple of days, I'm getting a first surgery, first time having anaesthetic, was a brain operation to cut through your bloody skull and take a biopsy of this and whatever, which is a pretty intense surgery. Like any time it's open brain surgery, there's risk that come with that. They're poking around with a scalpel in your brain. It's not great. Sharp tools and brain matter don't like each other. And it ended up, the diagnosis of the glioma that I have. And that was just a huge shock. It went from this invincibility, or what we would refer to as Afghanitude, the attitude you have on return from Afghanistan, this ego, this invincibility, this survival, this everything, the way you approach women in a bar to the way you'd get in a fight out the front of a club. It's all of that. And I'm sure we're not the only campaign to ever have that as well on return. It just felt like I'd been just shot down. There's this complex of this idea of why me, this idea of what do I do to deserve this, and of course this realization of your own mortality. All of things you do not expect at that age. All of things is very common in a diagnosis like this. So that was very difficult to overcome. Of course, I worked with a psychologist at the time. I got professional help from my oncologist. And this is a very big lesson for myself is psychologists work in a specific field, or they're an expert in a specific field, whether it be trauma, whether it be pain, whether it be divorce, however. You need a psychologist who's an expert in that specific realm. And the gentleman I worked with was a specialist in oncology, and specifically on loss, but not just loss of your partner maybe may have died of cancer, but a loss of yourself. And as we spoke about identity before, the identity of who I was had changed like that. My whole life had changed. From, this acceptance of you're going to live to 90 to we have no idea how long you may live. I'm 3 years past my predicted life expectancy. And him breaking down this into simple terms, being like, you're not the sort of person that needs a bucket list. He said there are people who come in that need a bucket list. They need to see Paris. They want to do this. They want to do that. To be honest, I've been to Afghanistan, so Paris is very similar these days. But he's like, you're not that sort of guy. You need a purpose. The problem was my purpose had really shifted because my military service, realistically, it came to an end in that waiting room. And I was dealing with a lot of trauma. And it wasn't trauma from service. It was trauma from the diagnoses. And he broke this down. He said, what do you think of a post-traumatic event? And I'm like, Jono gets blown up and I've lost my arm and this and blah, blah, blah. He's like, but what would you do when that happened? Okay, Willie, you're driving down the road, IED goes off, shit goes everywhere, you're blind, Jono's screaming, what do? I get in the radio, I do this, I do. He's like, you've at least at some point broken down that is a possibility of your life that could come, so therefore you have ways to deal with that, and step A, B, C, if you get on the comms, you get your gun, you do this. He said, you have never even once even thought that you could be dragged into a sterile doctor's office and be right, this ain't good, there's nothing we can do. And he said that to you don't have a step A, B, C, 1, 2, 3 following that. That is as traumatic as you can get, and that's a trauma response. And your loss of identity needs to be refound within this diagnosis as well. And that meeting in that office, I can still remember it clear as day, that really changed my whole outlook on the tumour as a whole. Funnily enough, he's actually the exact same psychologist who's helped me through the last round of chemotherapy, moving into, they call it EMDR, but it's a rapid eye movement, almost, I'm trying to think, what is it where they have the little swingy thing and it puts you under
hypnosis.
Hypnosis. It's almost like a hypnosis, but more clinical than that. And I thought it was all bullshit. But he helped me out unbelievably, be able to build a new identity with the drug, because that's what had happened. I've now done 24 months total of chemotherapy, but I'd built such an identity between the drug, me, and sickness that I could see the drug and get unwell, as if I was 6 months into chemo. And he in his office could break down with me through different exercises and this rapid eye movement to the point at which I am vomiting chemo sick without taking the drug. But all it was just building a new connection between what the drug is, or the trauma aspect is. Like, what is the trauma source? The drug, say, or it's this event or whatever, and building that into something more positive. Not that that event becomes less traumatic, but that there's a before and after of it. And what he broke down with myself was this is used a lot in bullying in workplaces. Where he said you might have a 10-year career, you got bullied on one day, and that's stuck with you, and you're stuck in this loop of, if you think of your job down at the DOT, you're stuck in this. And he said what we're trying to do is just break that loop and widen that loop. That event is not going away. But you've got several years before it, you might have had several years after it. We need to turn an image into a video. And as you know, a camera like we're filming on here will be 24 frames a second. You're stuck in this singular frame of trauma, whether it be an explosion, getting bullied, diagnoses with this, or a drug of which you've built the connection with, whether it be one of those. But you had years before it, you're going to have years after it. We need to build that from an image you're stuck on to a video that those images are in, but there's an after it as well. And helped me unbelievably. But that's why I'm always a big advocate for professional help, because it's worked for me massively. Even if I walked into his office and said, I'm a huge skeptic, I think this is all bullshit. And he was like, me too. But let's go over it together. And obviously, it's worked brilliantly for myself. At the end of the day, and in Australia, and especially if you're in the Defence Force or you're a veteran, your ability to access this is absolutely second to none. It's fantastic. Even just as a civilian in Australia, you get, I believe, it's 10 free mental health sessions. Veterans, I believe, it's as much as you need. And these are professionals in doing it. And you find a good one. You have these guys that are like the SAS of psychologists. Or psychiatrists if you need it way, and you find one you can work with. The best tip I ever got from him was, because he was looking at retiring, he goes, you need a psychologist of which you would sit down at a pub and have a beer with. You need to feel like that level of comfort. If you walk in the room and they say, and you're just like, it's just not clicking, that's fine. They know that. You're not going to offend them. Whatever. Move on. So it's been massively life-changing for myself. Look, the thought process was I want to be part of something bigger than myself. And also it was very difficult with typical jobs given my diagnosis. I'm not going to go do a 4-year degree at university because I don't know how long I've got. The police wouldn't take me, fires wouldn't take me, of course, with this medical condition. It became very limited at what I would do. But I wanted something big myself, and I was sick to death, as many are, of the narrative, the media, the singular story, the pseudo-environment of which we are told about the world and how the world works and how we are to think. And even though there's illusion of opposition, a lot of it's controlled opposition. It's moderate left, moderate right media that in of itself is owned by the same conglomerate at some point. It's controlled opposition to each other that creates, as Mr. Walter Lippmann would put it, a pseudo-environment, which is, it's true within this realm. So a pseudo-environment is basically you only present the facts of which creates this to be true, but you're leaving out all these other pieces that maybe have a contrarian vision of it. And at the time, I spoke to a few friends who work in different areas of the world of like, look, I want to get into like conflict media. How would I do this? And I'm like, look, you're not going to get picked up by, like, you know, the CNN's not going to hire you, or, you know, NBC or Fox. They're not going to hire you. And I was like, oh shit. Well, what if I just go to Ukraine and start filming and put it on YouTube? So I went to Ukraine in early February 2022, and by luck or by some grace of God or some grace of the devil, because it's been a horrible thing for now 4 years, I was there during the invasion of the Russian forces into eastern Ukraine. I was there on the 24th of February. My live stream captured some of the first Kaliber cruise missiles entering the airspace and impacting the airfield near where I was at the time.
That's a missile. That's a missile.
Hell.
Fucking missile.
That was one of those like hypersonic
Holy
fucking
shit.
missiles. Jesus Christ.
All right, we've got to.
Yeah, we're gonna hump it.
I can't fucking believe.
Right, we're out, dudes. Oh, maybe we'll stay. Right.
Are you good?
I'll speak to you soon.
So it just ended up, and that became at that day a career, I guess, for me. And that has moved a lot from on the ground reporting through to more analysis of the diplomatic political realm as well as war in general, and why war is fought, how war is fought. Because I think there's a massive misunderstanding of that war is just a tool of politics. It's a blunt force instrument, but it is a tool of politics. And it's when diplomacy has failed, war is what you're left with. And trying to explain that, but one of the freedoms of which I've got being now a YouTuber, if you will, which is the cringiest term ever, but is the freedom of time. So I can create, today's video, I believe, was 42 minutes long. And all it really focused on was this intractable gulf between where the US position assesses the war and where the Europeans are assessing the war. And how the European Union is about to give us a barometer of how serious they really are about the war. Because there's a lot of filibustering, there's a lot of rhetoric out of the European capitals, but not much actual reality or not much doing. If the Europeans had the military power of their voices, they would be great states as far as great military powerhouses. But in that, I can do it over 40 minutes of things that I think are very, very important, but where in the traditional media I can't. Traditional media, you're going to have to hold a narrative, and the narrative in the traditional media for the last 4 years has been that Ukraine is on the cusp of victory and Russia is facing imminent defeat, which has not been true whatsoever. And of course, it's far more complex than this. The idea that Putin is a radical, imperialist-driven, crazy man is also untrue. Has he done evil things? Yes. Is he a guy I'd want to have a beer with? No. Was he a KGB commando? Yes. But is he incredibly calculated and understand the reasons of war, why war and how war is fought? Absolutely he does, given Russia's history. So it gives me the time to do it and break it down and add nuance to pieces that I think are very, very important rather than a small little snippet. And I've been, I guess, successfully making that a career for myself. How long it will last, I don't know. That's fine. If I fade into irrelevance, that's also fine. I'm more than happy to go get a regular job. More than. Sometimes I wish I did. You wouldn't deal with the stresses of, I like to say 1 in 100 people is just an arsehole. And you run into them. If you everyday life, you run into an arsehole, say once a week, you meet 100 different people. But if you're there dealing with 230,000 people online who are subscribed to you about, volatile, high tension, high emotional stuff, you're going to cop a lot, which is fine. It's part of it, and if you're not willing to do it, well, you're in the wrong job. But sometimes I do fantasize about another job. But it was just something bigger than myself, seeking the truth, seeking the reality, and using my experience in the forces and what it feels like to be a soldier. There's a fantastic book, and I'm trying to remember the title for you, but it is all it is the journal of a German soldier in the Second World War. And it just displays beautifully just this regular young guy, has no idea what's going on in the Nazis, in Greater Germany. He's just a young guy who serves the nation. And it breaks down him losing himself throughout the war. I think it's called, it's something along the lines of like a devil to myself or something like this. You'll be able to find it. There's not many books like it. And that really inspired me to have this idea of I think I understand how these soldiers are. I'm not saying I've been through that or I'm in the situation, but I understand that if I was born in Kiev or Kharkiv or Bakhmut, that I'd be fighting in the Ukrainian forces. But if I was born in St. Petersburg or Moscow or Volgograd, I'd likely also be in the Russian forces. And the same as if I was born in Tarankot, I'd be in the Taliban. I think I have an element of sympathy of how these young guys feel and how they see the service to their nation as part of just part of themselves, but a lot smaller, down to small groups of men rather than this all-encompassing political attitude. Well, you touched on something really important of what is truth. Is truth objective, mathematical 1 + 1 = 2, or is truth relative, subjective, experienced? And I actually think this is the larger question that the Western states are going through at the moment, with a small change of maybe conservatism to more postmodernism, especially in more of the liberal Western states, is the postmodernism ways is interpretation and what is relative. And for instance, I think there's a really good example of truth and gender. This is a very good example at the moment in Western states. Because you've got one side says, well, gender is XX or XY. And another side will say, well, gender is a lived experience and is relative. Now, I'm sure your audience has their own opinion on this. I'm not going to get into that. But we'll get into that is a really good barometer of what is truth. Is it an objective this, or is it what you've lived, your experience, what is relative? Someone like Nietzsche is a fantastic writer on this relative idea of truth and experience. And this is where it gets very complex in these wars, because many different people have many different experiences. And this is why I said that if I was born in Afghan, there's highly likely I'd be in the Taliban. But then where does that start impacting on objective truth? Because it's not as easy as mathematics. We don't have an XY axis. We're not working on that. We're working with people, living people with, as you mentioned, biases. And biases are very, very difficult to overcome. And if not just as difficult to actually recognize as well. And your biases are everything. So you can have biases that are heritable. No one, people, it's highly unpopular to talk about, but there are things that are passed down. I guess you'd lean into almost like a race realism theory here, but there are things that people from a European state may see differently to an African state. It's not that it's right or wrong, but there's very grounded scientific research on it, that it goes beyond just these, tall, short, fat, skinny, black, white. Things can go beyond that. It's not saying that one's right or wrong, but we need to see that this is where biases come from. So, of course, there's this heritable, ingrained in you bias. Now, how much does that affect you? Well, it's not zero. We don't know how much it is. But then you've got your experience. And I think this is what mostly impacts. And I say 99.9% of humans are good people who care about others. And I've built that off travelling to Syria with ISIS in Idlib, to Afghanistan, to Ukraine, to interviewing guys in Wagner PMC, which is a brutal Russian mercenary group. Most people are good people who have had just their foundation of who they are is just an agglomeration of their experience. And it's recognising that to try and recognise your own biases. So, of course, I have a very Western bias of things. I have a different view living in a capitalist market economy. You've got different ideas to this. And to try and recognise this of how you are interpreting something or seeing an event take place, if you can somehow try and see where does my bias push this, and then be able to see that, you may see not that you're going to agree with their truth, but you'll be able to see at least how they see it. There's a fantastic quote about this, and I will mess it up, but to be a great analyst, you need to be able to see things from the enemy's perspective. And you need to be able to, if you're assessing the Ukraine war, my Western biases, serving in a military alongside NATO, being in Ukraine, having Ukrainian friends, this and that, I would lean on the pro-Ukrainian side. Now, many would like to think I'm the other way because I criticise currently what is happening in Kyiv, and I say, if you're not willing to criticise it, you're not truly caring about the people of Ukraine, because Zelensky's closest manager stealing a couple of $100 million is not helping the Ukrainian people. I'm on the side of the Ukrainian people, not on politicians or senior command in the military. But if you can assess it from how does Putin see this? As much as you may vehemently be disgusted and disagree, but how does he see this? Because if you're not able to do that, you won't understand the fundamentals of what is happening. And that in Putin's truth, he sees, if you try and look through his eyes, you will see NATO moving across Eastern Europe. You look from our perspective, we go, yeah, but these countries want to be in it. And it is, except for on a few circumstances, not solely, but most of the time has worked as a defensive alliance and has brought prosperity to nations and freedoms and whatever. But if you look at it from the other way, you may get a different idea. And if you want to analyse a situation, that is how it is. And there's a current overlap between analysts and activists. And a lot of the Western media are advocates. They are advocating for a certain truth or idea. They're not analysing the situation. They're not saying, for instance, Russia has fire superiority on the battlefield and manpower superiority. What they'll focus on is Ukraine's willingness to push back against this rolling, thundering army. Well, that's great. But that you're advocating for a narrative of the war rather than the reality of what it actually is. And I think that these two have just overlapped, where you get a lot of analysts who, sadly, I know a lot of these, who you speak to them having a beer in a pub, they analyse it very differently to then how they've publicly written for Russia or Rand or as a guest on paper. But some of them also get caught up in drinking just Kool-Aid. And I think this war is a really good barometer for that. Because you can clearly see from a Western bias, there's a victim and aggressor. But that analysis doesn't care who the victim and aggressor is in that case. It doesn't, an analyst doesn't care who's morally right or wrong. History and this idea that might is right is correct. We're still in a realm of power politics. And this is where, to go back to assessing truths, you need to take and nitpick a bit of where do I have objective truths and where do I have truth that is relative. And that's why I bring up that idea of gender. And if you ask me, not to get political, but if you ask me, I believe there are two genders, X, X, Y, with very, very limited people that may be a blend. But if someone were to ask me to refer to them as a pronoun, I would go, well, that is your relative to you, and I don't want to be a prick, so we'll do that. And this is where you need a decent balance of like, where is your grounding and your biases, and where do you feel about this? And then where is the human level of it? And that is a very hard balance, and I definitely don't have it right all the time. But there is, human truths are very, very difficult. Very difficult. Outside of the realm of physics and maths, other than that, everything is open to some level of interpretation. You get the, it's a Heisenberg uncertainty principle all the time. Well, one of the main things I advocate for is, I always say, often in my videos, if I'm the only person you're listening to on this, that's a mistake. I want your view. I make money off getting views. But you should not just be logging in and watching Willie OAM YouTube. No, you should be watching from the far pro-Ukrainian guys to the far pro-Russian guys and somewhere in between of where I may sit. You need to be taken, because we all have a bias, and these people are living in a realm of which they are true. Like, this is that pseudo-environment, which is one of my favourite terms that I talk about, is within that environment, it is true. If you only focus on the Russian fuel and then the Russian command and some tactical decisions, you can create this fantastic environment of which Ukraine is on the eve of about to roll back through Crimea and Donetsk. But if you, on the other side, just focus on superiority of arms and conscription, Ukraine's about to fall apart and be run over. And those are both true simultaneously in Schrodinger's box of truth. They are both true simultaneously, but you're leaving out all the other elements on this, and that's why a more holistic view of war as a whole, down to the humans fighting it. And you bring up about critical thinking, and this is one of the main things I believe. A lot of the issues we have, people bring up, the political disparity we've got and all these, and I'm like, I think a lot of this boils down to the ability for people to critically think. And if we could improve that, which I think would be very simple through going back to having kids read books of which are interesting and relevant, that doesn't just need to be some catcher in the rye that they just don't care about, they're not going to read it, they're going to ChatGPT an answer to it anyway. If you could get kids to read, explore information, explore different ideas, because if you read Crime and Punishment, the way you would see how Raskolnikov lives versus I is going to be vastly different. All of this. And that is very important, it's very healthy, and it creates a band of which society works within our objective and subjective relative truths. And I think a lot of it's falling apart because of that. But to seek truth, it should be what people are doing. And if you're just watching shit, you just agree with the whole time. I think everyone likes the idea of freedom of speech, but freedom of speech is not tested with what you agree with. It's only tested at which you defend someone of which you don't agree with. And a great example of this was, of course, the assassination, the murder of Charlie Kirk. I wasn't a big Charlie fan. I didn't watch much of his stuff, but people who came out and said, I vehemently hated Charlie, but this was a bad thing, freedom of speech. Those are the true ones of the defence of freedom of speech, in defence of different ideas. And God bless those people. If you think about the biggest movie stars, who, a generation now gone, may have had 10 movies, 15 movies, but it was an actor of this. You don't have these Joe Rogan-esque figures who have thousands or tens of thousands of hours of just who they are as their actual person. And that's going to be a very interesting thing into the future when people start passing. But it's sort of the memory outlives them in talk about who they were. And this is why what you do is such a fantastic thing. Of course, you're capturing a lot of people's stories nearing to the end of their lives. You've got the 103-year-old and the 106-year-old you've spoken of. It's quite an incredible thing. But the ability, the technology to be able to do it is there, and now preserve it forever, somewhere easy to see. Unlike, these stories, there was capture stories of World War I and World War II veterans in papers, but where are you going to go find that? Where's the interest in it? You're not going to clip it up into a short video and be highly disseminated through people. That's why it's such an important thing also. Well, that's like when I have done some interviews and copped a lot of flack over interviewing Russian soldiers. I'm like, I'm really interested in these guys. I did an interview with a guy who was in Wagner PMC after the fall of Bakhmut, and then they marched on Moscow. And I'm like, I think his story, that's very interesting. This is a moment in time that these guys went from fighting on the front line under a mercenary group. The commander of that gets shot down by the president, and then they march on the capital. You're telling me that to platform this guy, to hear what this guy says isn't important? That's very important. It's historically important. Incredibly historically important. Why then did he leave the Russian Special Forces to join a mercenary group? That's an interesting question. Of course, yeah, it is politically fueled, it's sensitive, it's all of this, but it's still highly interesting. Highly interesting. And that's why I'll defend to the absolute end someone like Tucker interviewing Putin. That is very important. Very important. Same as people interviewing Zelensky. It's very important, but you can't shy away from it either. I think there is a lack of self-confidence in veterans following their service. I was this in the army, but I don't actually have any formal qualifications, and where does that leave me beyond this? That almost that you don't feel welcomed in that community, that you're an outsider in it. And that's just not the truth at all. The life experiences people have, the ability to communicate, all of this can absolutely put you as the man in the arena. And it doesn't need to be in the veterans world. I think there's this idea that if you're a veteran, then you have to go into a business or a charity or a purpose that is something to do with the veteran community or the army. You don't have to at all. I've met heaps of people who had no idea they're from a military background, who have ended up in completely different jobs or scenarios, but they've taken those skills to which they've learned, and that they're not an outsider, that they have then carried across. And that's incredibly important and something of which veterans are uniquely set up for. But it also needs to be this idea that veterans are this perpetual victims is just incorrect. And we need to get away from that. And we need to get away from that as DVA, to the government, to the media, to veterans themselves. You were not just victims. We weren't conscripted. We were volunteers who went away and did this, who then, a lot of us were young, a lot of us did a lot, and then we got out and we had a lack of identity, and it struggled to find that. But there's a lot of support out there. There's a lot of fantastic other people out there who will support you as well. And what you've been through, you can set yourself up into something as well. And you've already done that. Just the hardest bit about joining the army is that initial signing up to go to Kapuka. From then on, it's oh yeah, but that's the initial step, I think, is very difficult following the army. And I can absolutely sympathise and see with how people get stuck in this limbo period following leaving Defence Force and not finding yourself, or never truly finding something again. And you may not. That's fine. It's a different stage of life. A lot of people will never find what they found in the army. But, you know, at the end of the day, there's just different chapters of life. And that was a chapter, and there's an end to it. But there's not an end to the lessons learned. So yes, the chapter is over, but the lessons, the characters introduced, the storyline of that carries through the rest of your book. And I think it's a fantastic thing. I'm incredibly, you know, I have less to do with the veteran community than I would like to, just for the busyness, but I'm incredibly blessed to still have that background to it. And it seems like, I met up with these guys the other day. They were gunsmiths from Idaho who were in Adelaide, who just hit me up like, hey man, I think we're near you. Do you want to catch up for a beer? And just seeing that there's this like a cross borders relationship of guys who have served and just done stuff. Like that's just fantastic to be part of this. Like I don't know what percentage of people are in the world serving in the military. 1%. I don't know. To be part of this like 1%, like we all sort of been through the suck at some point. And that's one of the funniest things I've noticed with talking to from Ukrainian soldiers to Russian soldiers to all these different people spoken of, including the guys in ISIS in Syria, was it sort of seems like it's like the same guys. You're like, this is fucking crazy that it's just different backgrounds, different ideologies, but it's this 1% who are attracted to this. And take it in your stride. Absolutely. You have these veteran stories where it's, you know, Mark Donaldson's really, you know, excelling in this area of the world and he's doing great, and which he is, he's fantastic. But it's like, but you also don't need that either. If you spoke, and I'm very blessed in being friends with Don. If you spoke to him, he's one of the nicest guys I've ever known. What are you doing? You know, oh, my kids are doing this and that's awesome, and I saw this and that. And you're like, yeah, there's this sort of public image of these veterans who are super successful doing whatever. But if you know them well, what matters to them is their mates, their family, how you're doing, and you don't need to be this 1%. You know, there's these veterans that make millions and they're highly successful, they're in parliament, they're doing whatever. But it's also fine just to be an average dude. That is completely fine. It is completely fine to be an average dude who works down at the local Woolworths and you've got a good group of friends and family, and that's enough. Because being very blessed to have met some of these like very highly successful people, that's at the end of the day what matters to them as well. Like that's all that matters to them. I use Dono as an example of this because he is the absolute epitome of a soldier, and then highly successful in what he's doing now. But he was also the first guy that rang me when I got out of hospital. He saw that I'd left hospital. First guy that rang me. I'm on the way to the beach with the kids. What are you doing? How you feeling? And I'm like, yeah. And that's what's really. He sees that as super important. And I use that story because I think it sums up, firstly, who he is as a guy, but also veterans looking after one another as well. I think there's this idea of a legacy is being remembered, as you said, beyond your death. So you hope to sort of outlive yourself. And I just want my legacy to be that he left nothing on the table. It's often put to the author Christopher Hitchens, but I believe it's actually another person of which he somewhat paraphrased I often burn the candle at both ends, but it gave a lovely glow. And I believe he writes that in his book Mortality, which is if anyone's having any struggles with their own life and death, and maybe even with religion, it's a very short book. You can read it in an afternoon. You read it in a couple of hours. It's the best book I've ever read in my life. Best book I've ever read in my life. Favourite book ever. And that's how I want to be remembered. Is sort of gave everything a go. I was fearless in approaching things. Either it was approaching the tumour, approaching reporting, approaching relationships or friendships, that I gave it a go. I gave it my best. I gave it my all, and it may have fallen apart at some points. You know, you discover things that are massively overrated. You discover other things that are underrated. But I want to remember it as just a good friend or person to be around. I am a very public figure with a very tight-knit, close friendship group. And that's happy enough for me. So it was just it was a good guy who gave a shit about other people, which I really do. Tried to see the best in people, tried to understand other people's situations and why I may disagree with them, even why we may hate each other. I don't need a bloody statue or a medal or this or that, God. That's enough. And quite beautifully in my life, I've been lucky enough to have a platform on YouTube, of which I've got thousands of videos. A lot of them is hours long, of which there's almost like a backlog of who I was, which is a very new thing. It's a very new thing, and that's enough for me.